Hey there, welcome to day 170, and we are in Acts chapter 5, verses 1 through 16. So, we're reading a story that may sound familiar to you. It's a story of Ananias and Sapphira, a married couple who were serving with the believers in the early church. And so, we just read how people were selling possessions, they were even selling land, and they were giving some of that money back to the church. And so it's kind of early form of tithing, if you will. Well, Ananias and Sapphira saw how respected some of these people were when they gave, especially gave sacrificially and gave this larger amount. And so they decided they were going to sell some property and they were going to give the money back to the church. But they were deceptive about how much they were giving back because they wanted the recognition. And so their pride gets in the way of what they're ultimately called to do. They were just called to give back and to serve each other. And they are trying to take the money, give some of it back, but say that they gave more. And so Peter ends up confronting Ananias, which we have to assume that Peter doesn't necessarily know about this. And so he is receiving some kind of supernatural power from the Lord to even know about what's going on. And he confronts Ananias and says, "Did you give all of the money that you said you gave back to the church?" And Ananias is in such shock that basically it says he falls down dead. And we don't know exactly why he falls down dead, if it was just like shock and heart attack. We see that Peter is not prophesying about a death, so it was not his doing. It was definitely an act of God that happens. Now, all this to say, we're not really sure why Ananias dies immediately upon this. While this is a sin and his pride is a sin, it's not such a huge sin that you would think that someone would lose their life for, especially in today's world. And so we have to think about maybe the situation, the scenario of where they are in this time. The church is brand new, just starting to build a foundation. And so people like Ananias would definitely not set the church off on the right foot. And so it could be that Jesus was basically calling him home early to set the church off with a stronger foundation. And when we see what happens next, we see Sapphira, his wife, comes in, and basically they've planned this out together of what they were going to do, because when asked about the money, she says the same story of Ananias, and she ends up falling down dead as well. And so it's the same thought here as if we assume that both Ananias and Sapphira are truly believers, then we have to also know that their sin, while sin, was not necessarily, was not going to separate them from heaven. And so we could actually see this as a gracious move on God's part to call them home early. And so if they were truly believers in the faith and truly Christians, then we would know that even though they had a very harsh way of leaving this world, that they were destined for heaven in the long run. And we have to remember that as Christians, we are not going to be perfect. Our pride's going to get in the way. Our greed will get in the way. There are things, sins that will cloud our judgment and that will cause us to stumble. And that does not mean that God is going to smite us. And it also does not mean that we are going to be separated from Him. It just means that we're human, and our human nature and sin will take over, and we have to listen to the Holy Spirit for that conviction. So after Ananias and Sapphira, of course, everybody's a little more fearful of how they're proceeding, which is, of course, establishing the early church. Just a couple of fun facts for you. In this chapter is the first time we see the word church actually used, and the word is ecclesia, and we'll see a book based on that word coming up pretty soon. And we have the early church being established, and then the people are actually bringing out all of, they still see these signs and wonders. Remember all the signs and wonders they prayed for? Well, they're happening. God is allowing his Holy Spirit to move, and people are thinking, even if I can get somebody out to the street and Peter's shadow will touch them, then they will be healed. Now, for us, that may seem a little extreme, but we have to remember a couple things that have already happened. One, remember when the woman touched Jesus's robe and power went out from him. We're dealing with the same power that is being given to the apostles during this time. And then we also have the story of, in the Old Testament, of the bones, where basically a man who was dead touched the bones of an early prophet, and when he touched those bones, because it was such a holy person, that it actually breathed life back into him, resuscitated the man for him to live again for a little while longer. So there's actually some historical references that the people will base this idea that even the shadow would heal their people. And so the disciples and apostles continue. And remember, at this point, when we say disciples and apostle, we're not just talking about the 12. We are talking about all the followers of Jesus, but of course, the 12 being some of the main ones. And they are beginning and continuing to build that early church that we eventually see today. So, hope you are enjoying our reading of Acts as we are building what we now know as the modern day church, and that you are just continuing to pray that God would lead you in the Spirit and in truth, so that you have the right words to say as people come across your path and that you need to share the gospel with them. So have a great one.